This is the new 2022 Maserati MC20, and it's a supercar from Maserati. That's a big deal because Maserati hasn't made anything like this for years. A mid-engine, high-performance exotic sports car. They've been focusing on sedans and SUVs, but now the MC20 is here, and today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era, now with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some fantastic sales recently, including this yellow Porsche Cayman GT4, one of my favorite sports cars, this wonderful Brabus Mercedes G63 4x4 squared conversion, ridiculous, this Land Rover Defender 130 pickup truck, this BMW M5 CS, a fantastic sports sedan, this old school BMW 635 CSI brought over $32,000. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. We have great selection and daily auctions. Check it out at carsandbids.com. So let's talk MC20. Like I said, this is a mid-engine exotic sports car meant to rival the best from Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren, and Porsche. Under the hood is a twin turbocharged V6. It makes about 620 horsepower, and it's mated to an 8-speed dual-clutch automatic transmission and rear-wheel drive. Pricing for the MC20 will start around $215,000, although that goes up fast with options and extras. This one is equipped to around $263,000. This car is also notable for being a big departure from Maserati. Maserati's last sporty sports car was the Gran Turismo, which came out back in 2008 and went out of production 3 years ago. And even then, that was more of a touring car, luxury car than a true sports car. The MC20 is blazing a new trail. Aside from the Maserati MC12 limited production multi-million-dollar supercar in the 2000s, the last time Maserati did a mid-engine exotic sports car was when the Merak went out of production 40 years ago. And today I'm going to review it. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the MC20 and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features, the Maserati MC20, with getting in, and that means starting with the key, which looks like this. Fairly normal, kind of cool looking key, but the interesting part is it's very heavy. I can't show this to you on the screen, of course, but it's a very heavy, weighty key, like they want it to really mean something, which I find to be interesting. But anyway, getting in, the door. Actually, first I want to talk about the rear view mirror. This rear view mirror is borrowed from Ferrari. It's the same one they used on the 458, the 488, and the F8. This car shares that mirror. Now, Maserati has made a big deal about how this car has its own distinctive Maserati engine, separate from Ferrari or other brands, but there is some part sharing like that mirror, and I'll show you some more examples inside. But anyway, getting inside and opening up the door, you stick your hand into this little hole on the side, you push up on an electronic popper, and then the door opens upwards. Butterfly doors, like you would expect from an exotic, sporty supercar, although the MC20 is kind of special for having these because the Ferrari F8 and the Lamborghini Huracan both have normal doors. You gotta get a Maserati if you want Lambo doors, which is kind of unusual. But anyway, next we climb inside the MC20, and right away you notice a little bit of a drawback to these doors, which is there's no storage pocket on them. You can't really put a storage pocket on a door that opens upwards because if you have anything in there, it'll just fly out when the door is opened, so you don't get any door storage, which is kind of a drawback. Now, interesting thing about these doors, they open up electronically, and so that means on the inside you don't have a traditional door pull, but instead this button here, which is a electronic door popper. You press that, and then you push the door open the rest of the way, and it pops open electronically, which is kind of cool. Now, you might be wondering what happens if you're inside the car and the battery dies or that electronic mechanism fails. How do you get out? Well, they have a fail-safe. You can see it here, this little loop you can pull to mechanically open up the door. You have one driver side and passenger side, and it's leather wrapped, looks very nice, and that would be your emergency exit from an MC20 in case of door popper failure. But anyway, next up, moving inside, one of the first things you notice in here is the interior is fairly basic, kind of Spartan. It doesn't have as much like drama and style as you get in a McLaren or a Huracan or an F8. It's a lot more sort of functional and simplistic compared to daring and exciting like the interiors in those cars, although functional and simplistic does certainly have its benefits, and I suspect some people will prefer this more business-focused interior. But to get this car started, there is a start button on the steering wheel. You can see it right here. You press that, and the engine roars to life. Now, getting it in gear, you go into the center here, and you can see one button is marked D/M. That's for drive. You push it, the car goes into drive, and you can start driving forward. If you push that button again, the M stands for manual mode, and then you're shifting yourself using the paddles manually, and if you press it another time, it goes right back into drive for automatic mode. Now, if you want to go into reverse, you can see there's a button right below D/M marked R. You just press that, and that's how you get into reverse in the MC20. It's all pretty straightforward. But the largest, and frankly the most interesting control here in the center, is the drive mode dial. You can see it here above the gear buttons, and it has sort of an odd operation. You start the car and you default to GT mode, which is Maserati's version of like a comfort or a normal mode. If you want to go into sport, you twist the outside of the dial. The entire dial itself doesn't twist, even though it looks like it does, only the outside twists. And then a tiny little light lights up below sport, letting you know that you're now in sport mode. Now, when you switch into sport mode, you can also see this little icon in the center of the dial has lit up. That's the suspension. It lights up to tell you that it is now in sport suspension mode. But if you want to go back to regular suspension mode, you can press the little suspension icon and you go back to a softer suspension that you would have in comfort mode. Now, if you switch back to a more comfortable suspension setting when you're in sport mode, all of the other sport mode things still stay active, like a louder exhaust and a more responsive throttle and things of that nature, but you can have more comfortable suspension. Anyway, there is yet another mode if you want it, and it's called Corsa, which of course means race. You twist the dial to the right one more time, the little light lights up under Corsa, and then you're in race mode. And now you can see the suspension icon in the center has changed to red. That means the suspension is also in race mode. Once again, you can press the little suspension icon and turn it back to white, which means you're back in sport mode, but you can't go back to comfort suspension when you're in race mode. You can only choose between sport or race suspension. Anyway, two other selectable items on this little dial. One, you can twist the dial all the way to the right and hold it there to turn off stability control. When you go into sport mode, it turns off stability control a little bit, but you can fully defeat it if you want to take that risk. You can also twist the dial all the way to the left and go into wet mode, which you might want to do if it's like wet and raining and you want the car to kind of calm down a little bit so you don't get into trouble. But anyway, all the rest of the controls here in the center console are pretty straightforward. At the very front, you have this little tub here, which is a wireless charging pad for your phone. You also have your power window controls here, as you can see, driver and passenger, and your power lock controls. You also have a little storage compartment here. You open this up and there's room to store tiny items, and you have a cup holder directly behind that, although only one cup holder in this interior. Your last control in the center is this one here, which adjusts the infotainment system. You can see it turns it on or off, adjusts volume, changes the track, very basic infotainment functions. Nothing especially unusual in the center console. In fact, it's probably most notable for what it doesn't have, which is climate controls. You don't have a simple climate control adjustment in here. Instead, that stuff is all integrated into the infotainment system. And yes, that means that no matter what you're doing on the screen, if you want to change the climate controls, you have to go into the comfort tab, as you can see here. It takes over the whole screen, and that means if you had the navigation map up for directions or the radio, well, it's gone now while you make your climate control adjustment, which is frankly kind of a disappointment that you have to go into a separate menu just for your climate control rather than fixed buttons or even a fixed part of the screen that wouldn't interfere with other screen controls. Now, it is worth noting you do have shortcut climate controls in the corners of the screen. You can see tap here, and then you can adjust your climate control temperature, or you can turn on your heated seat, but it's still a multi-step process on a screen rather than a simple push of a button like so many other car climate controls. And frankly, this is a drawback to a decluttered interior. Maserati wanted to make it simple, functional in here, take away excessive buttons, but in doing so, they may have actually made things more complicated because now you got to go into menus to make relatively easy climate control adjustments. It's kind of one of the drawbacks of a basic interior, and I think it could have been integrated better. But aside from the climate control situation in this car, I must say I do really like this infotainment system, although I have to laugh a little bit because Maserati calls this infotainment system the Maserati Intelligent Assistant, or MIA for short. But really what this is just a scaled down, different size version of the same infotainment system you get in all Chrysler, Fiat, Maserati, Ferrari vehicles. And so this isn't any more Maserati Intelligent Assistant than it is Ram 1500 Intelligent Assistant. But I like the system in the Ram, and I like it here too, just scaled down. Super high resolution, very configurable, very responsive, very intuitive, easy to use. You can pretty much do anything with it. Frankly, this is a really good system. But I mentioned parts sharing before with the exterior mirrors, and this is another example of parts sharing, but not necessarily a bad one, because this system is so good. But anyway, next up, moving on to the rest of this interior, quite a lot of quirks to cover in this fairly basic cabin. I want to start with the seats. These seats are very cool looking. You can see this Maserati blue on the outside and nice stitching, but they are not very buckety. For a exotic sports car like this, you'd think you'd have more heavily bolstered sport seats like so many others have, but not here. Instead, you get these relatively comfortable seats by comparison. Now, next up, another interesting item in this car, the rear window and rear visibility is an absolute disaster, which frankly is true of pretty much all of these exotic sports and supercars, mid-engine, tiny, low, you can't see much, but this car kind of solves that problem because the rear view mirror is a camera. You can see right now it's looking into that tiny window and you can't see a thing, but if you flip this little switch, it becomes a camera, and now you can see everything behind you. More and more cars are starting to adopt this feature, but it's especially useful on exotic cars where visibility is super compromised. Well, it isn't with a camera mirror. And next up, we move on to the steering wheel in this car, which is quite nice. You can see half carbon fiber, half Alcantara, flat on the bottom, very exotic car steering wheel. And you've got the start-stop button on the side, like I mentioned. You also have a launch control button over on the other side. If the conditions are right, you're in Corsa mode, you can launch the car with a very handy thumb button on the steering wheel. I also love the fact that the steering wheel has the axle lifter system integrated into it. It's right here, and it is so easy to get to. You're approaching a steep driveway, you don't have to wait to go into some menu, just tap that and the car lifts itself up, and then you can keep going. Very, very good placement of that. I also like the fact on the steering wheel that the paddle shifters are mounted on the column and not the wheel itself. That way you're twisting the steering wheel left, right, and the paddles are always mounted in the same place, so you know exactly where they are whenever you have to use them. However, I cannot give the same praise to the other item mounted on the steering column, which is the turn signal stalk, and operates in a very annoying way. You turn on the turn signal, and then this is one of those where the stalk goes back to the neutral position. So turning off the signal is a disaster. You push it down, that doesn't turn it off. You push it halfway down, that doesn't turn it off. You push it the other side, that turns on the other turn signal. It's really, really poor design. In order to turn off the signal, you have to give it a half push in the other direction, which is just not intuitive. Other automakers have all ditched this horrible turn signal stalk design. It's surprising to see Maserati bringing it back for a brand new vehicle. But anyway, also in this vicinity, you have your gauge cluster screen, and I have to say, I love the gauge screen in this car. In fact, it's one of the best I've seen in any car, exotic or regular. It's really easy to use, great resolution, and fantastically configurable. You can control the right part of the screen with this little button coming off the right stalk. That would be your windshield wiper stalk. You press this button and you can scroll through various different displays here, like your tire pressures or your tire temperatures, which is cool to see, or a G meter, or several different items over on the right. Now, you control the left part of this screen with the little button on the left stalk. It just makes so much sense. And you press that and you can see your trip odometer and a compass showing the direction you're traveling. And if you hold down this button at the end of the stalk, a giant navigation map takes over this screen, and you can see where you're going directly directly beneath your line of sight. And if you want the map gone, just hold the button down again, and it goes back to a normal gauge cluster. It's so easy to use. And I like the fact that the gauge cluster changes its display depending on what drive mode you're in. This is GT, looks like a fairly normal looking gauge cluster, but you go into sport and things get sportier and focus a little bit more on your tachometer. And you go into Corsa, and then you have this really cool horizontal tack across the top, and it really looks like a race car cluster to an extent. It's a really well done gauge cluster screen in this car. Now, final item in this interior, worth noting there's not really all that much storage in here. I already mentioned no door pocket storage, and there's also no real storage behind the seats. There's no like panel or compartments there to put stuff. You do have that little center storage area I showed you before, but it's really small, and you have a glove box in this car, but it too is pretty small, kind of minimal storage inside this interior. But while storage is rather minimal on the inside of the car, it is pretty good outside of the interior. I'm going to start with this compartment here. To open this up, there's a little button to the left of the steering wheel. You press it and it pops open, and then you can lift it up the rest of the way. And back here you can see two things combined: a storage compartment, which is relatively large, not huge, but big enough, and also the powertrain. I mentioned this car is mid-engine, and indeed it is, but the engine is small enough that there's enough room for the engine and a storage compartment under the rear lid, which is kind of neat and increases the practicality. And to increase the practicality even further, there is also a front storage compartment. To access that, there's a little latch in the driver's footwell. You pull that and this compartment pops open. You get in here and you can see a little compartment. Now, it isn't huge. It's mainly for like papers or books or something, but it is there, adding extra practicality on the outside. So a front and rear cargo area in the MC20. Now, there's a few interesting items worth noting back here. Of course, the engine is the main focus. You can see it here, twin turbo 3-liter V6, and it makes about 620 horsepower. Now, in this segment, 620 is a pretty healthy figure. That's more than the upcoming McLaren Artura. It's about the same as the Lamborghini Huracan Performante, and it is down on the Ferrari F8, which has 710 horsepower, but that car also costs a lot more than this one. So 620 horsepower, pretty good. It's not class leading, but Maserati says acceleration 0 to 60 in 2.9 seconds and a top speed of 202 miles an hour. So even though this doesn't have the biggest power number or the biggest engine size in this segment, it still gets it done with pretty excellent performance. And frankly, I think it sounds pretty good, or at least it sounds pretty good for a V6. Take a listen to a couple of revs from the MC20. Last powertrain detail worth noting, like I mentioned, 8-speed dual clutch automatic. That's the only transmission available, and rear wheel drive. No all-wheel drive for this car. It is rear wheel drive only. But anyway, a couple of interesting things to discuss back here about the rear compartment lid. For one thing, this trident on the engine cover. You have this glass cover to look into the engine, but you also have a Maserati trident integrated into it to act as like heat dissipation. Instead of just regular slats to allow the engine to vent heat, it is in the shape of a Maserati trident, which is pretty cool. Now, also back here on this rear compartment lid, you have this. This is the camera for the rear view mirror system. It's mounted right here above the third brake lid on this lid. You may be wondering, well, what happens when the lid is lifted up to the rear view mirror? Well, an interesting thing actually, an icon shows up on the rear view mirror telling you to switch it back to normal rear view mirror setting, and the camera is disabled. It's kind of a funny thing to see your mirror popping up a warning icon telling you to turn it back into a mirror if you actually want to see anything. But anyway, since I'm on the outside of the MC20, let's talk styling and design. There is a lot to cover here. This is a beautiful car, but beyond that, it is perfectly timed. Ferrari is currently trying to stretch out a 10-year-old design in its F8 using the same basic shape that came out years ago with the 458. The Lamborghini Huracan is also getting getting quite old, 8 or 9 years at this point, and the McLaren Artura, the other closest rival to this car, isn't here. It seems to be delayed. So a fresh face, a fresh design in this segment is a pretty big deal. Like I said, great timing. But aside from the timing, this car is just plain beautiful. Gorgeous, well-proportioned, attractive from any angle you look at it. It is a beautiful, exotic car. The designer of the MC20 said that other cars in this segment have like inlets and scoops and vents as kind of their focus, something that's celebrated, but in this car they've tried to minimize all that and go for a cleaner, simpler overall shape, and frankly, I think that was a great decision. This car looks fantastic, beautiful in its simplicity, exotic, gorgeous. It's really a nice design. Now, there are a few interesting design details that I think are worth mentioning and pointing out. One is the brake lights, which are very similar in size and shape to the brake lights on the Maserati Gran Turismo. They look almost like they came straight off the Gran Turismo. I guess Maserati wanted to tie in the MC20 to that car, and the brake lights are a good way to do it. Very distinctive look, and they look similar. And it's the same deal up front. This front grille is also intended to recall other Maserati models, and specifically sportier ones like the Maserati MC12, which also had a similar designed and shaped front grille, and the Gran Turismo, which had a sort of similar thing up front too. The MC20 has it as well as a tie-in to other Maserati models. Now, to me, one interesting detail of this design is this little line on the side of the car on the door. It says MC20 in silver, and then it has a couple of like little panels stretching toward the rear of the car. Not exactly sure why they did this. It's one of the few things that breaks up the otherwise simplistic design that the designer was so proud of, but it is distinctive to this car, and I guess these three little silver panels are intended to recall the three little like side grille ports mounted on the fenders of other Maserati models. And by the way, since we're looking at MC20 on the side of the car, let's talk about the name for a second. MC stands for Maserati Corsa, which is Maserati racing, and then 20 is the year this car was first announced, 2020. The name is sort of similar to the Maserati MC12, except that didn't come out in 2012. It had 12 cylinders, but I suspect Maserati thought that MC6 didn't quite sound as cool. And next up, another interesting item with the MC20's design. The designer of this car said that the upper part is intended to be the beauty part, the gorgeous, attractive, flowy body, and the lower part is intended to be the functional one, which is more computer designed and aerodynamic focused. And you can see the difference on the outside by looking at the painted surface, that's the upper, flowy, beauty part, versus the unpainted lower surface, that's the computer designed functional part, which is intended to maximize aerodynamics and improve the driving experience. The designer especially called out the rear of this car, where that lower part is especially large because, in his words, that's the business end of the car, where the engine is, where the exhaust is, and so the functional part sort of overtakes the beautiful part in back. Now, interestingly, this car doesn't have a rear wing, as you can see. The designer said it doesn't need one because of the way it was designed, the aerodynamics, the way air flows through it, blah, blah, blah. No rear wing is necessary for good downforce in this car. So it doesn't have one. And frankly, I think the overall design is the better for it. And finally, move on to the last interesting item with this car, and that would be pricing. The MC20 starts around $212,000. That's before options. This one is pretty well equipped to around $260,000. Obviously, it has quite a few extras. Some of the notable ones are a black painted roof. That's $4,000 extra. These wheels are upgraded wheels compared to the standard ones. They are $5,500 extra. The engine cover is carbon fiber, which of course looks cooler and costs more, at around $5,000 extra. And this car is also fitted with carbon ceramic brakes, which add $10,000 to its cost. Those options, plus a few others, bring this one to around $260 grand. Although Maserati told me this car is actually optioned a little light compared to other MC20s. They expect the average sticker price to be around $275,000 for one of these. Now, that is big money, but a lot of cars in this segment are really big money. It's not at all rare to see a Huracan go at least $275,000 and usually around $300,000 with options. A Ferrari F8 starts around $280,000, and some of them crest the $350,000 mark with options. So this, being kind of averagely equipped at around $275,000, well, that's a lot of money, but a relatively decent number for this segment. And so those are the many quirks and and features of the Maserati MC20. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the MC20. I've been driving around for a couple days and I have the following impressions. I'm gonna start with drawbacks compared to regular other rivals, Huracan and F8 and those sorts of cars. Okay, number one drawback to me is very clear when you really start pushing it. This car just isn't quite the performer that those cars are in terms of handling. It doesn't quite steer as sharply and it doesn't quite handle as well. It's not quite as balanced when you're really pushing it through hard corners. Now, I want to be clear, it's really balanced. It's more than a Portofino. It really feels like fast around corners and very nice and very tight. It's just not. Huracan and F8 are two of the most immediate, well-balanced, well-thought-out cars that I think have ever existed in the history of the car. And this just is close to that, but it's not quite on that level. That's not necessarily that bad of a thing. It's hard to be on that level, but this car is positioned as a competitor to those, and I just don't think it handles quite as well. To me, the other interesting drawback in terms of performance, little one, is I don't think that the transmission is as quick as I feel like it ought to be, given that it's a dual clutch. I think, again, Huracan and F8 have a little advantage here. I'm in Corsa mode, which is the very fastest mode, and it still feels like there's the littlest bit of lag. Now, we're still talking about a dual clutch, so it's not like it's laggy, but it's not as quite as quick as I feel like other dual clutches, not quite as seamless or fast to shift. Now, the last drawback that I have, the last thing I can think of here, we'll get to acceleration in a second when I talk about benefits of this car. The last drawback I can think of here, the interior. The interior in this car is fine. It's great, actually, but the Huracan's interior, the F8's interior just have a little bit more of a sense of like occasion to them, versus this car just doesn't quite. It's still nice in here, it's cool, it's everything you need. I just wish maybe it was a little more like, holy crap, that's cool. Those are my drawbacks. My benefits, the pluses of this car, acceleration is clearly one of them. Maserati says 0 to 60 in 2.9. Fully believe that. This car is really, really, really quick, and it feels as quick as a Huracan or other vehicles of that ilk. It really does feel like a quick, fast car, and I don't think this car is hampered at all by having a V6. In fact, if you hadn't told me that it was a V6, I would just assume it was a small displacement V8, like it is in the F8, because it drives pretty similarly to that, and I think that this car does not hurt for more power or more performance in terms of straight line. Next up, another big benefit of this car is the way that it looks. I mentioned it earlier, but I really want to underscore this point. This is a beautiful car. I saw pictures of this car and I already thought it was a pretty nice looking car. And then I saw it in person and I've been driving it around, and I swear the more time I've spent with it, even over the last couple of days, the more I've thought to myself, wow, I think this is probably the most beautiful of these entry-level Artura, Huracan, F8. Now, one clear drawback to this car that isn't a tangible one is the brand name. You know, for the last 5 years, 7 years, Maserati has been known as the brand with good lease deals. You know, getting a Ghibli for $5.99 a month or whatever was their thing, basically. And I think that no matter how beautiful this car is, no matter how well this car drives, they're gonna have a difficult time of pulling out of that and convincing people to pick this car over a Lambo or a Ferrari or a McLaren or whatever, because of the damage that's been done to Maserati's brand and reputation. Now, Maserati told me they're very, very focused on improving this, on lowering the number of cars they make, on making sure that supply meets demand and doesn't exceed demand. And so this is the first car in sort of an onslaught of product to help change Maserati's image. And I salute them for realizing it's a problem and for going that direction. Honestly, this is a pretty damn good effort at starting to untarnish that brand. There are certainly drawbacks to this car, like there are drawbacks to any car like this. I don't quite think it's as good as Lambo and Ferrari, but think about what I'm saying. Like, Lambo and Ferrari are established players that have been in this segment for decades. And the other cool thing about this car is it's just not as expensive. This is a value supercar, which is hard to believe at a $275 sticker price for most of these, but that's what this is. It really, really does stand out as a pretty damn good option, and I'm impressed with this car. And so that's the new 2022 Maserati MC20. This car is a big deal for Maserati. the return of a sports car supercar to Maserati's lineup. It's expensive, but it's also gorgeous to look at and thrilling to drive. And it'll be interesting to see if buyers will forego established brands like Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren, Porsche for a Maserati. We'll find out. Anyway, now it's time to give the MC20 a DOUGSCORE.
And the DOUGSCORE is here, 69 out of 100, which places the MC20 in excellent company against other entry-level supercars, which amazingly is a thing. The MC20 isn't quite on par with the Ferrari F8 or Lamborghini Huracan, as those cars are more exciting and handle a bit better. But the MC20 is beautiful, fast, relatively comfortable, and decently nice inside. And it's a pretty good deal considering how expensive all those other cars are. The question remains whether people want a supercar from Maserati, which in recent years has positioned itself as a decidedly unsupercar brand. But brand aside, the car certainly deserves consideration.